Now, the problem is that the California missions had an ill effect on the Native Americans there in California. Now, not all tribes went into the California missions. There were some tribes that were more in the interior of California that did not end up in the California missions, but many tribes were affected by mission life. Now, once tribes were put into the missions, there was a problem with disease, right? Because now they're living in this lifestyle that allows them to be exposed to a number of diseases, including diseases brought by the Spaniards themselves, okay? So there was a spread of diseases and epidemics going on in the California missions. We'll talk more about that as we move along. Now, one of the reasons why those diseases had such a serious effect on the California Indians living in the missions was because they didn't receive much medical attention from the missionaries who were there at the missions. Okay, so why? Why did the missionaries not try to cure the Native Americans who were living there at the California missions, right? Why didn't they do much for them? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. One, the missionaries believed that the natives were getting sick because this was a punishment coming from God. It was God's will that these people were getting sick and dying in such large numbers. And so the missionaries believed this, and so they felt that it was not their place to try to get in the way of the will of God. All right? If it's God's will, then let it be, and they just go on with day-to-day affairs even though people are getting sick and dying, even though they could have did something about it. Now, part of this mind state of the missionaries was that since the natives were suffering here on earth, this was a way of preparing them for a glorious life in heaven, right? The idea is that even though you may suffer in the natural, you may suffer in life on earth, when you die, all of that ends, right? So when your body dies, then your spirit goes to heaven, and all of a sudden you're in this paradise now, and you've been spiritually prepared for it. You've gone through your trials and tribulations while you were alive, and that is going to allow you to have entrance into heaven, okay? Because you went through those struggles on earth. That helped to prepare you and make you eligible to go to heaven in a sense, right? Because you went through your suffering. You paid for any sins that you may have committed, okay? And so this is contributing to that idea of that the diseases were punishments coming from God, okay? And so with this perspective in mind, you could see why the missionaries didn't really do much to try to heal the Native Americans who got sick in the California missions. Now, the friars, or missionaries who were there at the missions, they did not use the latest technology in terms of medicine, which they could have used, right? So recently, at that time, around the time that the missions were established, there had been new medicines that were created that would help to lessen the effects of horrible diseases like smallpox. Smallpox is one of the main diseases that was leading to the high death rates at the California missions. Now, and recently there was a method known as inoculations that would expose people to a light form of smallpox so that they would be able to recover from it, and then they would be immune to smallpox afterwards. Okay? And so these are inoculations. That was a method being used, that was a more modern form of medicine being used to combat smallpox at that time. And it could have been used by the friars in the California missions. But since the friars believed that these diseases were a punishment from God, they did not use this method of medicine. They did not use the inoculations to try to heal the native populations at the missions. So that's one of the reasons why the epidemics spread so much in the California missions and there was such a high death rate. Okay? It could have been prevented if the friars or the missionaries had did something about it, if they would have used these inoculations on the native people. Okay, so just bear that in mind as we move forward. Now, there were a number of reasons why there was such high death rates at the California missions. One of the reasons was because of effects from the environment. Okay, now in many of the missions, the environment wasn't too detrimental. It didn't have a huge effect on their health. But in some missions, such as the mission at San Francisco, it got cold during the winter months. And during those winter months, that cold environment would contribute to disease. People would get sick. I mean, you could imagine this, right? Imagine you living in an adobe house, and it's in San Francisco, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but it does get very cold in the winter, quite chilly. So imagine you're living in an adobe house, there's not a lot of insulation, it's very cold, you don't have proper covering. Yeah, you're going to get sick. That's what happens, right? And so that's one of the reasons why you see people getting sick and dying at the California missions, particularly in areas where it's colder, right? When it gets cold in the winter months. Now, other areas like Los Angeles, it doesn't get quite as cold, and so the environment in that sense wasn't as much of an issue. Okay. Now, another thing that's contributing to the rise of disease is the housing that Native Americans are living in. Okay, the effects of the housing. Now, so as I mentioned earlier, they're living in adobe homes. Now, an adobe home, as I said, is not very well insulated, and it also gets very damp inside of adobe houses. And so since it gets so damp, those are conditions that lead to the spread of disease. Okay, it's damp, it's cold, and it's easier for people to get sick. And you combine that with other effects that we'll talk about in just a little bit. Okay, so the housing is another issue that's leading to the rise of the spread of epidemics and diseases in the California missions. Okay, the adobe housing. Okay. Now, another big issue that led to the spread of disease was the unsanitary conditions, the unclean conditions at the California missions. And this had a particular effect on newborn children, right, or young toddlers. Okay, so how does the unsanitary conditions affect young children? Well, if you've ever seen a young child, even before they can walk, you have them crawling on the ground, right? They crawl on the ground. That's just what children do. They're grabbing things. They're sticking their hands in their mouth. Well, it's real easy for a child to catch dysentery in those type of unsanitary conditions. So if they touch the ground and their hands get germs on them, they put their hands in their mouth, they can get a disease called dysentery. And what dysentery does is it gives you diarrhea. Okay, and if you get diarrhea and you're a young person, you're going to lose a lot of fluids and nutrients. And if those fluids and nutrients are not being replaced, a young child could die. Okay, at this time, dysentery caused a lot of deaths. Diarrhea caused a lot of deaths for young children. Okay, because they're going to get dehydrated, and that was a major issue. And so this is affecting the death rate for young children in the California missions. Now, they're not the only ones that are going to be affected by those unsanitary conditions. It can happen to adults too, easily, right? But it's because of living in that mission environment. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, which is different from the traditional villages of the natives that led to the rise of these unsanitary conditions, okay? Now, another problem that led to the rising death rates at the missions was deficiencies in the diets of mission Indians. Okay, for one, they were not receiving enough calories in their daily diet. Now, we don't know exactly how many calories each person received daily. Right? What we do have is records of how much corn was produced and was kept in supply at the California missions. Now, the problem with these numbers, though, is they can be very misleading, because although a lot of corn and other produce was produced at the California missions, not all of that food went to the mission Indians who lived there. Right? There were portions of that food that went to Spanish settlers, colonists who lived in their own towns separate from the missions. And you also had military stations or presidios that were there in California as well. So you have military units that also need to be fed, and it's the California missions that are providing food for the presidios and for the pueblos or the towns of colonists in California. Right? So we don't know exactly how much of the food that was produced at the missions actually went to the native population. But by all accounts, it's most likely that the native people were not receiving enough calories to keep them healthy, to fight off the effects of disease. Okay? So if they're not receiving enough nutrients and they're not receiving enough calories, this leads to a state of malnutrition for the Native Americans living at the California missions. Now you may think to yourself, well, what does that have to do with anything? Okay, so they don't have enough food, right? How does that affect them? Well, when a person doesn't have enough nutrients in their system, that leaves them with a weakened immune system, right? And so their immune system isn't strong enough to fight off the effects of disease that otherwise, if they were healthy, if they had enough nutrients, they would have been able to fight off that disease. Okay, so that's a problem. That's why a diet that is deficient in nutrients can lead to the spread of disease, right? It can increase the effects of disease. Now, you combine that with the effects of other diseases, such as venereal diseases, like syphilis, which were widespread at the California missions, and you basically have conditions where people can be heavily affected by disease, right? So weakened immune system, venereal diseases. Why venereal diseases? Because of rape. By Spaniards in many cases, right? Yes, that's right. You had a lot of rape going on by Spanish colonists or by Spanish military in particular of native women. They would give them venereal diseases like syphilis, and then that would contribute to lower birth rates for these women, okay? It'd be less likely that these women would be able to give birth to a healthy child because they had syphilis, this venereal disease, and because they had a weakened immune system. Okay, so that would contribute to lower birth rates. All right, so yes, the combination of a weakened immune system because of malnutrition combined with other diseases would lead to lower birth rates at the California missions.